Welcome to the Restoring Our City podcast, where we have candid conversations on today's topics to help connect our community. And it's the return of the Mac, as they say. We've got my fellow co-host, Jeswin Thomas, back on the pod. Jeswin, it's great seeing you. We just saw you a couple weeks ago. How are you doing, man? Welcome back to the pod.
Yeah, I mean, we're gonna make a podcast of what happened in the months that I was gone. But
Yes,
for now, we're doing good. Our baby just started teething, so I just need
yes.
some sleep, man. Pray for us.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Great to see you and your family and your little one deserved some time off. And I know we're going to unpack your story too. And honestly, you shared your testimony at one of our recent church conferences in Chicago, which was great to see. And we will unpack that on a pod soon. However, I think that brings up the question of church conferences anyway. Put out some reels if you saw on our social media about church conferences, had a lot of fun helping out with PCNAK, which is our Pentecostal conference in North America, whatever that acronym is. But we want to talk about this because it's summertime. There are a ton of different church conferences going on. And honestly, you and I grew up going to church conferences. What's your favorite thing about church conferences? Favorite memory? What comes to mind when you think about this season?
Yeah, to be honest, I haven't been to a church conference like PCNAK in quite a while, probably over a decade plus. And so, while I don't have a specific story, it was just going to the conference with a lot of us older folks that have not been to a conference in a while and just reconnecting with them. I've seen church members that I haven't seen in 10 plus years, or people within the Penti community that, again, like I've lost touch with, just to be able to reconnect, have conversations, see how life is going, and then realize that even though our paths all diverge, we're sort of all in a similar boat. And now that we're reconnected, we can, uplift one another, pray for one another, and see how life is going moving forward. But I don't know about you, Joby. You were part of the organizing of this entire thing. So I don't know. Have you got a chance to rest? How's your processing of all this been?
Yeah, I mean, still processing a lot in a good way. I've just been in Chicago traveling for the past, I think, 4 out of the 5 weeks. It's nuts. So just got back home a couple of days ago. So still trying to unpack, first of all. But I think when it comes to conferences, one of the things, I mean, core memories growing up, going to church conferences, is you make a ton of friends across the country, which I think is so unique, right? Because you can go to different states in America and you'll know someone, which is not common for a lot of people. And I think these church conferences spurred those relationships. I remember probably growing up in the 90s, I'm a little bit older. I mean, back in the heyday, when you're talking Bulls, Knicks, heated rivalry, but then you'd go to the conferences and you have nothing to do with basketball, but you see people from New York and you're like, wow, you're my rival, right? Like you are my total enemy because you are from New York. Nothing else matters, right? And it's just the sports rivalries carried on to these church conferences and tournaments, which is silly to think about when you're older, but it's fun. It's just this city pride that you have when you go to a national conference to rep your city and participate as well. So I think those are some of my favorite memories. But then you think about the magnitude of these conferences, how complex they are to put on. You start to think about, hey, is this worth it? And I think that's something that I wanted to explore with you, Jeswin. Massive budgets, massive time, effort, a lot of headaches, a lot of politics when it comes to church conferences. You start to unpack it a little bit and say, hey, is it worth it? I mean, what's your take when you think about that? Is that even a valid question to ask? Is it worth it to have these church conferences?
100%. I think we'll probably unpack some of the good stuff and the bad stuff. And that's the thing, I think that's the question I would almost ask myself too, right? If we were to put the good and the bad on like one of those balancing scales, does the good outweigh the bad or does the bad outweigh the good? I'm not
Mm,
100% sure, but I will say, and this is again, just props to everyone that put on PC Night this year. I think it changed my own paradigm of what I thought this conference was based on past experiences. And I came out of it super blessed. So I might just be riding a spiritual high right now and saying everything is worth it all the time. Then again, I wasn't having all the headaches of what's going on in the background or worrying about how the budget was spent or all that different type of stuff. But we should definitely bring up some of the goods and the bads and what people
yeah.
complain about for sure and just unpack some of this.
Totally. I think there are a lot of aspects and details behind the scenes that people don't see. They kind of from an attendee perspective, may be critical of conferences, the budget, the grand hotels, and the time, effort, and money spent. But then you don't realize and you don't see the testimonies that come out on the other end and things that actually shape people and their spiritual lives to be a real catalyst. So I love how you mentioned the spiritual high. There is an aspect of a conference high that people experience when they go to these gatherings. It's an annual gathering once a year. You come out of it super excited and on fire for God. And then you go home on Monday and it's like, all right, reality sets in. All my problems are still there. And how do we avoid that? How do we avoid the spiritual high? I think it's a valid thing to unpack. But let's first talk about some of the things that I think church conferences, if we had to define it, how would you define it? Because it's not just the Penty folks that we grew up with. There's a ton of different denominations that have these conferences. I mean, even in the business world, right? We all go to like business conferences or tech conferences. There's commonalities in there that I think are really valuable. So what are some of the things that are kind of the benefits that you see or the common things that we all take as a benefit to attending one of these things? So what are some of those things that jump out at you when you attend a church conference?
Yeah, I think you mentioned some of the stuff, whether it's networking or to go to connect with people that you've seen in the past are definitely things that come to mind. But, it's interesting if we think about especially our Malu conferences denominationally, there's aspects of ethnicity that come into play, there's aspects of spiritual denomination that comes into play, and you at least have to at least recognize and I think it was a cool realization to see, 2,000, 3,000 plus people in the same room with you that look exactly like you, that speak the exact same language as you, that come from the exact same background as you, being like, oh yeah, this is the slice of heaven where you see some of the brown people here, right? And we are represented in this room and we will hopefully be there as well. It's almost like a glimpse into what is God doing through your divine ethnic background within your community and to be able to hear those stories and share them with people that are, exactly like you so that you guys could spur each other on to live more faithfully for the Lord moving forward. I think is just one of the big takeaways for me specifically.
I love how you said that because there is a shared experience. Because you can say, hey, why shouldn't we just worship with every single person, every single ethnic tribe, tongue in America, right? When you go to these conferences. Well, there's a shared experience that I think we all have. I think about on one of the evenings, one of the main speakers was addressing the crowd, and he said something like, I hear you all speaking Malayalam, and he didn't really pronounce Malayalam correctly. But then you hear this collective laugh in the audience. And I don't think the speaker understood his mistake because everybody else did because he mispronounced it. And I just thought that was so fascinating because it's like we were all in on the joke because we're all from the same place, right? And we have the shared experience. And I think that plays into a lot of the questions, the things that we wrestle with, the experiences and doubts and fears that a lot of us, because we grew up from the same place and same type of environments, that we come to these conferences seeking some of the answers that we probably wouldn't get from a more generic conference, right? So I love the commonalities that we have with our people group because I think it's really healthy to have those environments for us to explore and address with each other, right? We're not alone,
Yeah,
you know?
100%.
So yeah, so when we think about like, okay, we've got really great speakers, we got great worship environments, really talented people. There's so many great things about these conferences. When we think about the value that they bring, if you had to say, hey, these are some of the things that are highlights to me when I go to a conference like this, I know we just came off of one. What were some of the highlights to you, like the value that these conferences actually brought to you?
Yeah, so value wise, when I think about church conferences and maybe even diving more specifically into what is the point of even doing a ethno specific denominational conference? And I think that's one of the larger questions a lot of us have, right? Because and we'll get into some of the pitfalls of doing an ethno specific denominational conference. But some of the values that I saw were, coming from the Pentecostal conference to do a seminar on what do we believe about the gifts of the Holy Spirit is such a big fiery buzzword taboo type of a
Yeah.
topic. And the thing is, if you go to 100 different Prendy churches, you probably are going to end up with 100 different answers. The good thing about doing it in a conference setting is all those 100 different churches are in one room together. And we are talking about it in a common way with a common understanding of what do we believe, what should we explore, how do we think about this specific topic. And I think that is incredible to do. And I think that is such a massive value driver in a conference like this. That's definitely one highlight that comes to my mind. I don't know if you have another one that comes to your mind.
Yeah, I think it's a great perspective because you have all these churches coming under one roof and being able to ask the questions. So, personally, just for full disclosure, I was helping organize some of these workshops, and we had these individual sessions where people talked about various topics. And one aspect I really loved about it is that we put the anonymous questions that you were able to submit via your phone, via Slido. And it was really cool. Received hundreds of questions anonymously, all the things that you wanted to ask that maybe you're afraid of or weren't able to ask in your local church setting. You were able to do that at this conference and in these sessions, and it was so incredibly cool to see the commonality in the questions that people had. And even though you might go to an AG church or you came from an IPC church from a Penty background, right? Like a lot of people have the same types of questions, and you can gather a sense of what's really plaguing the community, what's on the top of mind for our people. And if you're not at a conference like this, you're not going to see, you won't get that pulse check of what's actually important to our people. So I think that's where I love those environments that we can craft to tap into people's hearts, really. So I think that's where we can tackle that a little bit more in a session.
Yeah, and I was gonna say just props to you and the entire team working on the workshop. Some of the topics, just for audience to know, some of them were just very, topics that we're all talking about. Like, why are people leaving the church? That's an incredible one to dive into. Even trying to figure out, like, sometimes coming from a Protestant background, we think Jesus came in Acts chapter 2 with the Holy Spirit, and stuff happened in the early church, and nothing happened for 2,000 years, and bam, like revival happens somewhere in the early 1900s, and now we're here. It's like, no, what happened to the connection? And you had an entire session on that. And I see almost like a biblical value to this too, because if you think about some of the stuff that the early church wrestled with, like, hey, do Gentiles have to be circumcised? We don't have a common understanding of this, and 100 different churches might think about 100 different things. Let's all come to a conference in one place and ask the question. And I see that as such a correct biblical use of what a conference should be about. And I give mad props to the people that put these topics on because y'all did phenomenal job.
Man, if that's the next year's theme, we're in trouble. But I think it's a really funny, analogy, but at the same time, very important one and a
Yeah.
biblical one when we talk about scripture, like, why did people gather together? Obviously, outside of just church and gathering together to worship the Lord, but, like, if we had to gather together to make decisions, because especially in the modern church today, and when we talk about a lot of different denominations, they gather together at these annual conferences to make some real critical, hard-line decisions on doctrine and what you believe in, what your stance is.
Yeah.
And it comes to a lot of controversial things, right? And I think it's really important for us to gather as a people to talk about those decisions so we're aligned when we leave. And I think that's where, when you talk about, man, denominational conferences, what is the value in it? Because, yes, from a high level Christian perspective, there are some core mainline items that we all agree on. But then when we talk about our doctrine, even the secondary things, I think it's important for us to actually talk about it and explore it and come out of it stronger. Whether you believe it or not, it's not to say you're completely wrong if you don't believe this, but isn't there value in coming together as your denomination to say, hey, this is what makes us who we are and why we believe it? Makes sense for us to gather together and talk through those things. Sometimes we don't talk about those things. We just gather together just to get together. Is that probably one of the reasons why we may be critical of these things? Because we're not actually tackling our denominationally specific items?
Yeah, I mean, I think this again, like, I want to give a lot of credit to this specific, conference that just happened in Chicago because it was very different from previous ones that I've been to 10 plus years ago, right? And not to say what happened 10 plus years ago didn't have value. It just left me with the perception that people go to conferences in order to do a few things. Network, which is fine, right? But network in a way to, like, hey, let's go to a conference and meet a spouse, someone that looks like me, that believes the same thing, right? Probably better than meeting someone in a bar. This is probably like the right way to do it if you're gonna do it, right? Just flirt and see what happens. People come together just to play basketball, right? Like, what city is going to take the basketball trophy or the volleyball trophy? Or who cares, right? Like,
Batman.
we're brown people in a Pentecostal environment. We don't got the skills compared to most of the world out there. Let's just be honest about that. Or who is is playing for the worship set for this specific city or that specific city? Who's the drummer? Who's the guitar? Who's the lead vocalist? Like those were the kind of things that really irked people. And on top of that, there's definitely conferences where massive deficits were run, right?
Yeah.
Deficits that caused people and even conveners to have massive amounts of stress, health related problems that came out of that. And you just have to wonder, like, was this money spent and the debts that we're taking, like, how does that glorify God, right? Is really one of the ultimate questions that really probably left a bad taste in people's mouths. And ultimately, like, what are we doing missionally from all this, right? Who's getting saved, right? What is the purpose? Probably was some of my perceptions from past conferences. I don't know if you had similar ones, but yeah, being
Yeah.
very candid, that's where I was at.
No, honestly, I think it's worth it to have this conversation because honestly, we're not looking at this to say, hey, let's criticize all these conferences or let's be really specific about the nuances that maybe somebody couldn't help, right? However, every time we go to a church conference, I have this conversation with multiple people to say, hey, how is this organizationally run? Are we actually leaving a burden or not empowering the next city or next place that's going to host this conference the next time, right? There's a lack of continuity, but organizationally, that is a conversation that happens every year. And I mean, this was the 40th anniversary of this specific conference. And I mean, I grew up going to it, took a long break, and this is probably the one that I've been involved with the most. However, it's been this same narrative of like, man, are we just like running into stress for these people to take out loans and like being in a deficit. However, I think there's value in understanding these learnings from an administrative standpoint so that we're not doing something just to do it to cause a headache, but are we actually getting something out of it? When you mention like, hey, are people getting saved? That might be a tricky part because like everybody coming to it is part of a church, generally speaking. However, I hear that story all the time, especially younger people who might
Yeah.
might not be as mature in their faith coming to this and really understanding the gospel in a different way, or they get to be removed from their local church experience and be in a completely unique environment where they can really hear and be immersed in it's almost like a church retreat, right? Like you get away from your local everyday life. So I see that, but we can't escape the criticisms. And I think that we really have to tackle them head on because for all the valuable things that we just listed, there are some certain things that we have to address to ensure that it isn't just a spike of a conference high in our lives that we can actually carry forward to our actual daily spiritual growth, right?
Yeah. Or even as a practical takeaway, and just to bring a comparison to play, one of the things that I've always appreciated about a conference like Passion, right? A large, super large gathering, but they'll always have an aspect to say, hey, we're all going to donate to this one cause, right? We're going to give money to fuel something like Bible translation has been what their focus has been for the last couple of years. We're going to try to translate the Bible into every languages. And this year at this conference, we're going to pay to get the gospel in this language to this specific people group that has never had it, right? You think about like the call to give to something toward that, it almost implies like the budget of the conference is almost like taken care of. Now we are saying your money is going to be missionally used for something else. Versus a lot of time with the call to give in many different conferences, almost like we have a deficit and we just need the money to pay the rent of this thing. Like, what
Yes.
motivates me to give so that this ballroom is paid for? You know what I'm saying?
Right.
Not to say that we shouldn't pay for the ballroom, but if we're going to have the honest conversation of is it worth it, it is one of those things that it's almost like, hey, with our collective resources that we have in this room, shouldn't we be able to do more monetarily for the sake of the kingdom? And not to say that every conference hasn't done it. In fact, the last time, I don't know if you recall this, Joey, the last time PCNAK was hosted in Chicago, the organizers did such a good job from a budgetary standpoint that they ran a massive surplus. And with the surplus, they decided we are going to build homes in India for people that do not have it. And that was such an amazing cause and a testament to say our collective resources could do something amazing for the kingdom. And that is a great purpose for us to all come together for a conference. And again, we see that biblical example again, right? Hey, our brothers and sisters are suffering in one part of the world in Jerusalem. Let's all take up a collection and come together as the universal body to do something about this. And I would love to see that done in future conferences as well.
Yeah, I think there's probably a lot of administrative details in there that we may not know, and especially from like Passion on a larger scale,
Sure.
probably a lot more donors,
100%.
registration costs, and things like that. There's so many aspects to it that make that possible. But I totally see your point because there has to be a connection point to why. Like,
Yeah.
why am I attending? And I think that's what we're the heart of what we're trying to have this conversation about because we totally see the value. Maybe it's not articulated as well in some of these spaces. And I think we really need to connect that narrative because I've been so blessed by these conferences where I think we just need to articulate the connection of like you should come not just because we're gonna host this every year or because it's in Chicago, it's our hometown. No, it's because this could be the catalyst for you and the future generation. I think it's such a unique position to be in, especially when you're talking about ethnic specific, denominationally specific conferences, because man, it's crazy to think there's thousands of us that have the same questions, have the same experiences, and that we aren't alone in it, right? And I think there's so much camaraderie that can be built and community that can be built that honestly, like I've experienced friendships that have lasted a lifetime because of, now you know somebody in Dallas and New York and Philly. Like you can name every state, right? And you know somebody there, right? It is absolutely bonkers to see that. But then also it's centered around a Christian communal experience, which I think these conferences can be. We just need to articulate that better so that people feed into it for the next generation,
Yeah,
right? We don't want to lose that. So,
absolutely.
so we think about, all right, well, cool. These conferences have a little bit of value, but there's also some critiques about it because we may not connect the dots there. What about these folks that go to a conference and you experience a spiritual high, right? And I think this is very true of a lot of conferences, no matter where you go. You go anywhere for a weekend and you're like, wow, that was the most amazing experience. But there's a pitfall in that too, right? Like, how do we, when you think about this term, conference high, like, what does that mean to you? And where are the dangers in experiencing something that might be positive on the outside, but could really be a detriment for you on the inside?
Yeah, I was gonna say, a synonym for conference high is like mountaintop experience, right? And I think that's a term that's definitely one of the Christianese episodes that we probably have talked about in the past. But the mountaintop experiences, I think there's like two mountaintops that came to both of our minds, right? And I think one of them that immediately popped into my mind was just the Mount of Transfiguration, right? You have Peter, James, John, and Jesus going up the mountain, and Jesus is transfigured, talking to Moses and Elijah. And they are probably experiencing something that I can't even imagine what kind of high that would have been, right? To the point where Peter's like, yo, let's build some tents. Let's call it a day. We're all just going to chill here, sing kumbaya. This is it. And Jesus like, no, 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 no. We're not doing that. We're going to go down the mountain, right? Go down the mountain, and what's the first thing they encounter? They encounter a demon possessed person, right? They go from the highest of highs to dealing with something from the pits of hell, all in the span of going down this mountain. Now, when we talk about, how do we avoid the pitfalls of a conference high? I don't think we can. Life is going to give you something that you're going to have to deal with, and you're not always going to be on the mountaintop. But I think what's going to be interesting, and I'm just speculating here, right? Using some divine imagination. I wonder if Peter, James, and John, like later on as they're traveling down this path of, building the church and going through different church related issues and all the headaches they had to deal with after, even despite the fact of Peter denying Jesus and all this type of stuff. And even John, toward the end of his life, I wonder if they go back and be like, man, I'm so glad I went up the mountain with Jesus because I still remember the feeling of what that transfiguration moment was like. We need those testimonies and we need
Yeah.
those highs because when we get to the lows, what are you going to remember, right? Like when life throws at you, what are those experiences that you're going to remember and say, man, that was such an anchoring point for my life. And I cannot deny what I experienced that day. That is my perspective on it. I don't know if you
Yeah.
have a different thought there.
No, it's a great analogy. And I think even carrying on to that, like, that's not what sustains you. You have to spiritually walk with the Lord daily, like dying daily. And there's an aspect of not just a moment, but there's a daily walk. I mean, Peter, right after that, when we talk about denying Jesus, right? He went through a crazy mountaintop experience, but still flipped 180 degrees the other way, right? I think the passage that came to mind was First Kings 18 and 19 when you talk about Elijah and talk about mountaintop experience, right? Fire comes down from heaven and all the prophets of Baal is just embarrassed, right? Because of what the Lord has just did. And then I love how the scripture in the very next chapter, Elijah is completely despondent and he's like, take my life, right? And he went from this amazing high to the lowest of lows. And you think about how the Lord responded, rest, eat, talk about some practical responses from the Lord. And I think, I was reading a few theologians in their commentaries on this. I think there's actually, it's a book by Eugene Peterson where he talks about a long obedience in the same direction
Mhm.
where you just need to have this like sustained daily discipleship versus this like consumeristic type of experience when you go to a conference, right?
Yeah.
It's crazy to think about. We go to a church and conference and we're like, wow, look at the lights, look at the sound, look at the band. And then you go to your local church and you're like, man, it's not the same, it doesn't hit the same.
Yeah.
And so I think we really have to be weary of that and be aware of the emotional aspect of being in a different environment, but understanding the heart behind why these conference experiences might be a catalyst for us and the core reason of the Lord speaking to us and transforming us,
Well, even
right?
thinking about the heart behind it, I'm gonna throw a third mountain in here, right? You can even go to a conference for all the wrong heart-related reasons. Maybe you went to play basketball. Maybe you went to see who was playing in the band. Maybe you went to be on the stage to do some sort of task. And you're like, I don't get why everyone's going to this conference. And I'm thinking about Jonah, right? Here's a dude, belly out of the fish, spits out into Nineveh, and he goes halfway into, like, he clearly did not want to speak to the Ninevites, right? He says the most simple phrase of God is about to bring judgment to this place, walks like a third of the way or halfway into the city, calls it a day, leaves. And then he goes up to the mountain to do what? To wait for God to destroy
Yeah.
everyone. And you're like, bro, you missed the point. You are witnessing the greatest revival in like history happening before your eyes. And you missed the point and you didn't experience that mountaintop or you didn't experience the purpose of this conference or the spiritual experience because your heart was totally in the wrong place. And
Yeah.
maybe some of us that are going to these conferences having these misperceptions, and I was probably on that boat too, thinking that this is what the conference is really about. This is what the heart of the people is really about. They're coming to meet a spouse. They're coming to play some games. They're coming to play some instruments. But you go to it with the wrong perception, with the wrong heart, you're probably not going to get much out of it. But if we just leave it for the side to a second and say, hey, you know what, God, I'm going to come and I'll receive whatever you have for me. I wonder if our experience would be different. And we do have those testimonies to move forward in this life so that when we do face those hard times in life, we're like, oh my gosh, I actually did get something out of that conference this year because I was focused on what God had for me and not worried about
Yeah.
what my perception was about the people.
Dude, it's so valuable, that insight, because my pastor just talked about it this Sunday morning about when you're in worship too, you're either worshiping or you're critiquing someone else in their worship. It's like those are the two things you could do, right? And you're not involved in what God is doing. You're looking at it from an outsider perspective. And I think that's where a lot of the criticism comes in, for better or worse, right? There's probably some valid reasons why conferences don't go so smoothly, or you might have egos in the room where people want the stage. That's probably true to some extent, but individually, what can we control? Being with the Lord and having our eyes set on him, no matter the circumstance, no matter the sound or the reasons. And that's what I really loved about this past conference is you could kind of see the heart intentions for a lot of people, which was really, really great to see. But sometimes, there might be things that go wrong where a session runs late and then you get people who are like, oh man, why is this not on time, right? And then they just feel the frustration. But then you understand that there's people who have it with the right intention to put their time and effort and money into bringing a community together. I think that's such an amazing thing. But when we think about these pitfalls to avoid, especially if we go to church conferences, especially in the summertime season, we might be trying to chase those experiences, which is not a great thing, right? We should be pursuing the Lord, and is kind of like a Jesus juke in itself, right?
Yeah.
But when we think about these experiences, we shouldn't be chasing the conference experience, but we should really try to center ourselves on what the Lord's trying to speak to us in those moments, right? Are there any other pitfalls that you would warn people about if they're really hyped about a conference, what they should avoid and be aware of?
I'm trying to think, I think we touched on some really good ones. And at the end of the day, some of the again, like there's a lot of secondary stuff that we could potentially make primary, whether it's let's find a spouse at a conference or let's do X, Y, or Z at a conference. But I also wanna say, a flip side of the thing is it's okay if you primarily are going there to speak and hear from God, and you do have a secondary desire of trying to find a spouse, right? Trying to win that basketball game, trying to, like, do the best that you can at, like, your worship set. That's not a bad thing. I'm gonna be out here and I'll go on the controversial route and say, like, that's not a bad thing. That's actually, an admirable thing, right? Like, God does care about our felt needs. God does, it is a good thing to connect community in various different ways, whether it's sports or music or different things like that. And I do think that these conferences are a good place to bring those things out. Now, let's just make sure that they're secondary, right? Like, is if there's a secondary
Yeah,
desire
yeah.
and you keep it there, that's a great way to avoid a pitfall. Just please don't, only come to conference to find a spouse, right? If God happens to provide you one, great. But if he doesn't, great, because he provided you himself.
Yeah, no, totally. I think that's where I honestly think we should lean into some of those things, right? Because there's an actual honesty that people are coming for a social aspect, which I think we should lean into a lot
Yeah.
more to say, hey, there is a reason why we all share some of the same experiences and same faith. Like, why not come to play basketball? And I know we were joking in one of our clips, right? Like, hey,
Yeah.
don't come just to play basketball. It's find the right purpose in coming in, but please lean into some of those things because I think in those experiences, we find community, right? And we center ourselves around the Lord. But I think, just landing into a conference just for that experience and letting that be your only spiritual nourishment, I think that's where it could be a pitfall, right? And you can't experience the Lord if you're not in a 30,000 seat auditorium, right?
Yeah.
Like fashion or something like that. You can be with the Lord in your closet and then experience the same you know, uh, touching of the Lord and the Spirit and whatnot. You can really hear from the Lord in your closet versus just a stadium too, right? So I think that's where I get a little weary. So people are too excited about conferences and like lean into the value of the environment versus the relationship. But like I know from a denominational standpoint, there are some really valid questions that we should explore, right? But if you had to ask, or tell listeners, like, all right, before you go to your next conference, like, what should you prepare yourself for? How should you tackle going to a conference if you needed to change your perspective and not just dive in and chase an experience? What would you tell them?
Yeah. I think, and maybe I'll talk more personally for me for this conference. I think, this year, and we'll get into future pod. A lot of this revolved in a season of life where we've been wrestling a lot with parenting, more specifically with our son Luke, and we'll get into the circumstances of his birth, different things going on in that perspective. But he's been born for a couple months, but God's grace, he's doing great. And there's still some questions about like the future, right? I think if you're open to honestly wrestle with like, what is my life actually looking like right now? Like, Lord, what do I need you to meet me at before you go into an environment to try to meet with the Lord? I think he gives you a lot of perspective and God can provide you answers and a lot of healing. And that's what I feel like we experienced at PCNAK this year. There was a lot of good time for us to share our story, but also receive a lot of prayer and feel like, yeah, God met us where we were at, especially on like the last day of the conference with the message and different things of that nature, right? Like it's really the preparation of the heart, right? And I think sometimes we're not aware of where in life are we actually at? What actually are we dealing with? How do we actually feel about something? And so therefore we don't actually know where does God need to meet us, right? Like what exactly are we seeking the Lord for? But if we can do that before we go into a conference, I think it'll give us a lot of perspective. And I think it will even almost directionally enable the spirit to really help and facilitate how God meets us at some of these events.
Yeah, you never know what you need. And sometimes it's just the other being around other people speaking into your life that you never know what you need. And I think that's where a conference like this or just being around people from your community who have really are leaders in our community to speak into your life, pray over you, and to just spend time in worship, right? And hearing from great speakers, I think it can be a catalyst for you. And I think just having that open-minded heart to go into an experience like this might change your perspective. I think a lot of us have gone into these conferences really critical of things. I mean, I can't tell you when I said I was going to join the team and help out with this conference, a lot of my peers would say, "Hey, are you really going to do that?" And when I came back, for those that didn't attend, they're like, "Hey," kind of sarcastically, "How did it go?" Right?
Yeah.
And I really had to say, "No, this was amazing. It was just an amazing experience." And I think there's this preconceived notion that if it didn't work before in years past, it's not going to work again.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we should be more open minded to what the Lord can do, and it really can change circumstances around. And I think part of it is our generation is evolving and our people are evolving and really understanding the heart behind it and having people really involved in ministry to lead some of these things. It's a game changer too, right?
Right.
So understanding you have the right people, the right team with the right heart can create an environment where, I think you even said it in your testimony that you could pray for the impossible, which I think really touched me. It's like we cultivated an environment that did that. And if you can go to a conference like this that can tap into that, you can really leave changed. And that should be the catalyst for the rest of your life, right? The rest of your week.
Yeah, and honestly, I'll even bring maybe one more story into it too. It's like, maybe God knows what you need before you even get there. Maybe you can't articulate that and you still go to the conference anyway, right? Like, how is God going to meet you in your spiritual walk on like a day to day? And again, using one of those things where, hey, you might go there to meet people, but even through that desire, like God can change your life. So years ago at Passion, when Stephanie was there, she ended up meeting a group of girls and, it was on someone's heart to say, hey, for some reason, I feel like we should all stay connected together and do like a small group. Now, mind you, they're all in different states, they're all in different like time zones. But even before we all had to go to Zoom for COVID, they did an online Bible study. They called it BSG. And that lasted for almost 7 years, right? 7 years of sisters walking together with the Lord on a weekly basis, going through the word, talking about life, having this virtual community, all because they were in the same place at the same time and met the same people. And you can't imagine, like, what does, like you said, the same long obedience in the same direction. Like, what can that look like when you have a community of people doing it with you for almost a decade of your life? It's a very transformative experience, but it wouldn't have happened had they not been at this specific conference. And again, like, how can God orchestrate even things that you don't even know that you're gonna need, but you were just available and you were willing to be in the right place at the right time for him to facilitate that in your life, you know?
Yeah, totally. I think there are so many stories that have come out of conferences. I know we got some messages on Instagram too of just how people have changed because of a conference. And I mean, I think about even this ministry, man. There's a crazy story about how Rock started because of one person just being obedient and like trying to find some crazy kids in Chicago, and telling them that the Lord has something planned for them. And then this started, and you're talking 20 years later, right? It's crazy to think about. I look back whenever I have a season of doubt, right? I think back of those moments and say, wow, this isn't all for naught. God is orchestrating something. And just hearing your story, hearing all the people who have been impacted by a conference, it probably wasn't the best well run conference, but one moment, one singular moment could change the trajectory of your life, right? And that's because God is orchestrating things behind the scenes. So, I mean, honestly, this was a really great experience, but we'd love to hear from you, our listeners. Tell us your worst conference stories. Tell us the transformative ones, the inspiring ones, right? I'm sure many of you met your spouse or met someone or made connections or friendships, right? There's probably really great things that conferences did for you, but also we want to explore the value and what can we do better? What can we do better? And what would you like to see in our communities to strengthen them, obviously for the glory of God ultimately, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah. Jeswin, I think it was really great to see you in person, and it was really great to hear your testimony. We will definitely talk more about that. I'd love to dive into your story more on a future episode. But till the next time, I think we're too old for tournaments, right? I don't know if that's in our foreseeable future.
We need to have like a
Maybe a
30
rock
plus, like,
conference.
well, we need to at least have like a 35 plus tournament. We're at the point where we need to start breaking age brackets so we can let
Yes.
the young kids do the good stuff and the old people just do the slow stuff. It'll be a phenomenal
I
experience
mean,
next time.
there was a badminton tournament. I think that is up our alley now. Like, I think
Badminton.
we've
Now, why
got to.
isn't there pickleball tournament? That's a sport that everyone's getting into.
All right, let's do it. All right. Well, enough votes, enough likes on this. We'll start a pickleball tournament.
Yep.
But definitely good seeing you, buddy. And then we will chat again on the next episode. But yeah, let us know, like, subscribe, send us your feedback. We'd love to hear from you guys. And again, and a quick shout out to everybody who attended this last conference, who pulled us aside and said, yes, we listened to the pod. Can't tell you enough how encouraging that was. It was just random folks that would come in, and obviously some of them that we knew, some of us that we didn't even know you're listening. But to the bottom of our hearts, thank you so much for continuing to listen. One person mentioned that, "Hey, don't worry, you're not speaking into the void." And I was like, "Thank you for saying that." That's awesome.
Definitely appreciate it and can't wait to connect with everyone in person at the next conference. And before you do that, take like $10, put into a high savings interest account. And so by the time you get to the next conference and they ask to give, you've done your part.
There you go. Wise financial advice. This is not financial advice. I need to put the disclosure in there. So thank you, Jeswin, and thank you, listeners, and we will catch you on the next one.
All right, peace.